Hello, so this is going to be a video all about what camouflages you need in what seasons, because strange enough I've spoken to some people on YouTube who seem to think no matter what time of the year it is, what the weather conditions are like, one type of camo will work all year round, which is sadly not really true. Now, maybe if you lived in the Sahara Desert all year round you'd just wear a desert camouflage, maybe some of the American deserts you'd go with one of the arid desert camouflages and they'd work all year. But I still suspect even in some of the American deserts that you'd have some flowers that come out even in the desert, you know, during some times of year and not others. And the point is obviously that if the weather conditions and the seasons are, you know, correct or not correct in a sense for your camouflage, then you suddenly have a problem because your camo doesn't blend in anymore, especially if its colour palette is totally wrong. So, let's first, I'll show you a very famous camouflage. One of the most famous camouflage patterns probably in the world. It's British 95 DPM or Woodland 95. So this is one of the premier, I guess you'd call it, woodland camouflages, designed for use in Western Europe. It's green, brown, black and sort of a tan sort of colour. There we go. So you've almost got two shades of mud in there, green, and the black is meant to simulate shadows, but as I've said before, I'm glad that now black is being replaced on camos by either very dark brown or very dark green, simply because that actually does a more realistic job of imitating shadows. But this is this camouflage. When people think of camouflage in Britain, most people still think of this. However, this only really works at some points of the year. It works very well in spring when everything's very green, and it works very well in winter where you've still got some plants which, like, you know, evergreen kind of things and ivy, but lots of stuff is just brown and muddy and horrible because it's winter. However, you'll find in the autumn, obviously, there's not many bright colours in this, so when you've got bright coloured leaves coming off all the trees, it doesn't do a very good job. And in the summer, especially now where we've got a heat wave, lots of grass is actually going yellow and dying, and stuff like that. So this actually looks too green and too lush. So that's the issue with 95 DPM, the woodland variant, is that as much as people think it would work all year round in Britain, it really doesn't. Okay, so what would I then suggest? Well, at this time of year, something like multicam or MTP actually ends up working better, simply because it's a, you know, designed for both desert and sort of, it's designed to work everywhere basically. And why I know people complain about this camo because they go, well, it doesn't work completely well everywhere. That's not the point. It's meant to work well enough in a couple of environments, rather than having a camouflage that suddenly sticks out if you go from sort of desert to a tree line. But the point is that this is good enough for what it is, and lots of nations for years and years have been trying to come up with multicams, East German flecktarn being one of my retro favourites. That was great, except it didn't have a disruptive pattern, but in general it was the same sort of colour as this uniform. So, here you go. Obviously, as you can see, this is kind of like faded greens on this in a sense, and there are darker greens to make contrast in the camo. And there's lots of kind of browns and yellows, which are meant to obviously be quite arid looking colours. Now, this does work surprisingly well. Quite a few people, as I said, seem to hate on these camos like multicam and MTP. But if you see them in the field, or being worn by people, they do work surprisingly well. And as I said, I've worn MTP trousers in lots of my camo tests. I am currently trying to organise a summer camouflage test. Sadly wasn't able to do one in spring because I had a lot on, and other people I normally go and take the photos with had a lot on. But hopefully you'll get an arid summer looking one. And for that I'm probably just going to wear full MTP for one of the camo tests. So, you know, the trousers in this and the shirt in this. And just see how well that works everywhere, you know, to get an idea of how well multicams essentially work. But as I said, when you've got a summer and everything's going dry and arid, you actually want something like this because of how much dead grass and, you know, dying plants there are from the absurd heat, you know, and lack of water in a sense. So even if you're in a place that's normally lush, if you're going into a drought season or something like that, something like this suddenly becomes a much better camouflage. However, yes, I would totally agree that you can't wear it absolutely everywhere, but, you know, if you could only have one type of camo, I would recommend some sort of multicam, just because you know it's going to work most of the year round, to a decent degree, rather than having something that works exceptionally at some parts of the year and then not at all in others. But what about when it comes to autumn? Because other than maybe this looking like some dead leaves that have lost their colour, this isn't very bright and interesting. Well, for something like that you want Swiss Alpenflage or flecktarn, because especially if you get the older flecktarn prints, which are much more reddy and orange compared to the more modern flecktarn, where they've kind of just made it a boring brown colour. Because these have all these bright reds in it, and flecktarn has the bright sort of yellows in it as well as reds, it works surprisingly well in autumn. Now, a lot of people don't think this. Loads of people go, oh, that's a crap camouflage, it would never work. Watch actual videos of Swiss soldiers from the Cold War wearing this. You'd be surprised how well they actually blend in. Part of the reason for that is, I think other people have mentioned this before, the red at a distance doesn't look like the same sort of shade of red it looks up close. At a distance, the red looks like a different shade of brown because of how the eye works. And of course, remember that the eye in theory doesn't work as well as we think it does. That's how camouflage works. At a distance, shapes get to be broken up a bit by the camo. The red probably does help break the outline out a lot more. And, you know, then the brain doesn't process it as a full shape. That's the idea of camouflage. So, like I was saying, for the autumn, you're probably going to want flecktarn or Alpenflage, because if you're wearing something that's very green or very brown, and then you've got lots of brightly coloured leaves, you suddenly look darker and more, you know, vague than everything else, I guess, in the area. But this is the thing you need to consider, just, you know, as I'm explaining, that when you have different seasons, you have different colour palettes, different plants around for most of the world, and depending on what the weather conditions are like. So if you have a very hot summer, that will affect the colour palette than, you know, if you had a mild summer. So the point is that, you know, if you are choosing camouflages, you do have to think about this. There is not one, and as I was saying about multicam or MTP, even with those, there is not one camo that can do everything. It's physically impossible because we have seasons and things like that. Now, MTP, in my opinion, comes the closest, simply because I think it's a very good kind of bland colour palette, and that's what you want in a camouflage for a lot of the time, a bland colour palette, because bland is boring to the eye, the brain doesn't pick up on it, and the colours generally naturally blend in most parts of the world. I think there'd be very few places where bland browns and bland greens wouldn't blend in. But hopefully this has got you thinking, if you've not really considered this before, that at various times of the year you might need to switch your camouflage pattern around if you definitely didn't want to be seen, because otherwise, you know, you might stick out like a sore thumb if you're wearing green and brown, sort of almost, you know, like the 95 DPM, bright green and bright brown, woodland camo, and all the leaves and plants dead, and everything ends up being like arid browns and yellows. You're going to look far too luscious and green for the environment. So there you go, hopefully that's been a useful video, and hopefully you take on board what I've said.